Hello, everyone. My name is Surya Dev. I am a professor at the Macquarie Law School and also the director of the B&HR Access to Justice Lab at our law school. And on behalf of the lab, I would like to welcome all of you to this virtual event, which is going to discuss the future of business and human rights under the Trump administration. At the outset, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Walamatukal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and traditions have nurtured this land for centuries. I also pay my respect to the elders, past, present, and emerging. So it gives me a great pleasure, everyone. Thank you for joining to this virtual discussion, hopefully interesting discussion about the future of business and human rights, which we're going to use as BHR as the acronym under the Trump administration. And we're going to focus on the impact of the Trump administration, both within the US as well as the ripple effect outside the US. And to discuss some of these issues with me, I have two excellent experts on this particular field, and I will briefly introduce them. They have very impressive profile, and I will not have the time to go into much details, but let me start with a brief introduction to Joanne Bauer. She is an adjunct professor at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and she co-founded with Anthony Ewing, who is also online, it seems, the Teaching Business and Human Rights Forum. And more recently, Joanne established and co-founded the Rights CoLab. The second expert we have is Marti Flacks, and she is very well positioned to talk about this issue because she has worked with the US government for more than a decade now in various roles at the White House, the State Department, and most recently in the Commerce Department, working on a range of issues. And of course, she has also worked in different organizations on business and human rights issues. So thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you to you, Marty, as well, for joining from the US in your evening. So let me start with you, Joanne. And my question to you is that how do you see what was happening in the BHR landscape before the Trump administration took over recently? It is recent, but it looks like a lot of things have happened in the last less than 2 months. And if you can walk us through briefly that what is likely to survive out of the Biden administration BHR initiatives. Over to you, Joanne. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you for organizing this. I am going to do my best to be measured in my remarks, but it is really hard not to mince words about what is happening under the Trump administration. And before we start, I just feel like we need to ask, what is a BHR initiative? Because, frankly, this administration is taking a sledgehammer to our institutions. And this has an impact not only on corporate accountability efforts that provide the necessary guardrails for business, but also on the ability of responsible business to flourish. So, just in the last few weeks, and I was saying before others joined the call that you can't really prepare for a webinar like this too far in advance because everything is rolling out in such rapid time that you will be out of date if you prepare too early. So, so much is happening, and as you said, Surya, it's by intent. The administration has curbed enforcement of key laws aimed at reining in corporate corruption, like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Corporate Transparency Act. It's gutted agencies that have been tasked with protecting the public from corporate malfeasance, like really important Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that came into place in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis. And it's laid off about 200 of those Consumer Financial Protection Bureau workers. And I guess it cannot do so any longer because of a legal order by a US district judge to cease that practice. But it's withdrawn from the World Health Organization and the Paris Climate Accord. There's been mass layoffs of federal workers that creates family instability. And Trump has suggested that there's an intent to privatize key public safety mechanisms. And of course, we're all familiar with the 90-day pause on U.S. foreign development assistance for the assessment of so-called programmatic efficiencies and consistency with the United States policy. So that's an order in which all department and agencies have to, with responsibility for United States foreign development assistance programs, have to pause those new obligations and withhold disbursements of development assisting funds for existing programs. And this is also impacting B&HR initiatives that were receiving that money. And now you have the UK FCDO, its USAID equivalent, now having a cutback in its budget because they need to, everybody kind of around the world now needs to adjust to make up for the money that is lost from USAID and elsewhere. And this is all being done in the context of where the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, has been placed in a position of power. That's allowed him to make these sweeping changes to our public institutions. And so, it's not lost on us that you've got rising inequality in the United States, and the richest man in the world that also has a serious conflicts of interest with his own businesses taking control of government. And I would just add that it's also impacting important federal programs that even businesses rely on. And also, you mentioned in the introduction, I have an affiliation with Columbia University. They are also, according to Project 2025, intent on tearing down American public higher education universities, and have shot their first shot across the bow with the withdrawal of $400 million of federal funding to Columbia University, and I think it's some 60 cease and desist letters to universities to stop teaching DEI. So all very, very difficult, and none of this is helping business. And the particular big news is this sort of huge value of, say, the S&P 500, 400 trillion of which has been wiped out due to the tariffs. I think it was just today that Canada announced retaliatory tariffs. So everyone we know is quoting Gramsci's famous lines from a fascist prison, where he said, "The old world is dying and the new one struggles to be born. This is the time of monsters." And so I think I just wanted to start with that broader perspective on when we think about B&HR initiatives. I think we're thinking, and I know we're going to talk next about that, but we're really thinking about we need to think more broadly, and as you so often do, Surya, in your own work, but to get specific on what we can easily label B&HR, I would say that with all eyes having been on the EU and its rollout of regulations, less attention has really been paid to actions under Biden, in which the US actually has played a really significant role. And Marti is really the best place to speak about all of these activities, but they've played a significant role in strengthening corporate accountability and
And
due
maybe we can
diligence
bring
laws
Marti
abroad.
in now
Let's
on
bring
that
Marti in
point.
now.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
a good idea.
So thank you for setting this context, Joanne. That's very helpful, and I would say it's a new world disorder that is being created. And Marti, so if you can compliment Joanne here in terms of the specific initiative. Let's say we used to have a national action plan. What is going to happen to that? Any other initiatives, including the customs prohibition of the things which could potentially be made out of forced labor, all these things. So if you have any reflections on that, that will be very helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks. And thanks so much for having me for a very timely discussion. I mean, I think I will just echo what Joanne put out there in terms of the framing. I think we're in a very difficult, very dark time, and there isn't any denying that. And so I think in that context, I'll talk a little bit about some of the Biden administration initiatives. What I'm going to be careful not to do is provide sort of a roadmap of things that maybe someone hasn't thought of to cancel that maybe should be targeted for for cancellation. But I will talk a little bit about kind of where things were left off at the end of the Biden administration and the inklings of where things may be going based on what we've seen so far. So I think Joanne put it well to say that, the situation in the US, although internationally was getting a lot less attention than these massive legal developments in the EU, there was a tremendous amount of work happening around BHR and the Biden administration. A lot of that was happening below the level of legislation, particularly in the last 4 years, although we have some pretty important pieces of legislation that were passed, including around forced labor that I'll talk about in a moment, that have been really important. But a lot of it was happening at the administrative, regulatory, and policy level across the US government. A lot of it driven by the Biden administration's focus on labor rights in particular. And so over the 4 years, I think it's fair to say we saw probably the strongest support for organized labor and for labor rights that we've seen out of a US administration in many, many decades. And that was reflected in any number of initiatives from, really overwhelming support from the administration for efforts by workers to unionize across the United States in some new industries and difficult corporate environments, to really robust enforcement of some of those laws around the prohibition of goods made with forced labor entering the United States, to the development, as you alluded to, of a National Action Plan on Responsible Business Conduct, the second NAP, which followed one that was issued at the very, very end of the Obama administration 8 years ago. And so we did see quite a lot of momentum. I think the most important change kind of structurally that I saw from the Obama administration to the Biden administration on business and human rights issues was the breadth of US government agencies that were interested in and working on business and human rights related issues. This used to be quite a narrow focused issue set. Some folks at the State Department, Department of Labor's International Labor Affairs Bureau, a few folks at USAID, and we really saw across the administration, from Department of Homeland Security to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, which does fishing, seafood industry, a really broad number and large number of agencies working on business and human rights related initiatives, and just even being educated and understanding what that meant and thinking about their role in that ecosystem, which is quite a sea change from even 4 years prior. The couple of laws that I think are worth mentioning, because they are obviously still in place. So beyond what we narrowly think of as BHR, I think it is important to just echo what Joanne said about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and the Corporate Transparency Act, which one is a very old law from the 70s that prohibits US companies from bribing foreign officials. The Corporate Transparency Act is a very new law that hasn't even fully entered into effect, that requires reporting around beneficial ownership of companies, both US companies and foreign companies operating in the United States. The Trump administration has announced it will suspend enforcement of both of those laws. I think that has more of an impact personally, I think, on the Corporate Transparency Act than it will on the FCPA. And we can get into that if folks are interested in, but a huge sea change in terms of US posture. The Biden administration and many previous administrations had really robustly enforced the FCPA in recent years. And the Corporate Transparency Act was the reporting requirements were about to enter into effect, and now will not enter into effect, at least for US companies, which is including foreign owners of US companies, which makes very little sense when you think about the point of corporate transparency reporting requirements. So those pieces are frozen, and that is a huge problem. We also have, as Joanne said, the freezing of US foreign assistance, which is, of course, also congressionally mandated. A lot of the BHR programs and just in general, a lot of the work that USAID and the State Department do on technical assistance in these areas are congressionally mandated. And so there will be litigation around that, but a lot of that has been frozen. And then we have our two forced labor enforcement laws that are incredibly important for the BHR space. One is the Tariff Act, which is our general law that prohibits any goods made with forced labor from entering the United States. Because of a loophole in that law, it was not enforced for about 60 years. It went actually about 80 years. But at the very end of the Obama administration and beginning of Trump administration, Congress closed that loophole. And so it's actually, ironically, the first Trump administration that started robustly enforcing that prohibition. So it will be a very interesting question to see if that policy continues in this administration. And then about 4 years ago, Congress passed the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which specifically targets goods coming out of the Xinjiang region of China and basically creates a presumption that if they come from that region, they are made with forced labor and can't enter the United States. And over the last 4 years, enforcement of that law has really skyrocketed. Department of Homeland Security, which enforces that, has taken it very seriously. Congress has devoted substantial resources to enforcement. Billions of dollars of goods have been stopped at the US border that were coming out of Xinjiang. And so that's another initiative that, again, the law is still on the books. There's been no announcements. And there's pretty significant constituency in Congress on both sides of the aisle that supports that legislation. If enforcement continue, we're waiting to see if enforcement of that is going to continue as robustly. I will say, just before wrapping up, because I know we want to have a discussion, so much of what we're able to get done in government is not just a function of the policy position of the administration, but the resources that they put into it, right? Everyone's heard this expression, sort of people are policy, right? And so if you don't have human beings, bodies, butts in seats in chairs to do the work, and you don't have money and resources to put into the effort, it doesn't matter that you have a policy in support of or against something. So the cuts that they are making to the federal government, to the employee workforce, to foreign assistance, to the operating budget of these agencies is going to have an impact on all of these policies, whether they've made a specific decision to cut back or not enforce something or not. So we just have to keep that broader context of, every department and agency at this point, every unit of every agency has lost some percentage of its workforce, and those cuts are going to continue and expand, and that's going to have an impact on all of these policies as well.
Thank you very much, Marty, for bringing us up to date to what was there and how it has been impacted so far. And I think you made an excellent point towards the end, that even if something is not posed, because of the firing of the staff and the resources not being made available to those agencies to enforce a particular law or a policy, that in effect could be that things are posed, even if they are not posed officially. So I think that's an excellent point. Now, all the participants, please jump into, because we want to make it more interactive discussion as well. So I will strongly encourage you to either post a question in the Q&A button at the end of it. Alternatively, if you would like to unmute yourself, that option is also there. So please raise your hand, the virtual hand function, and then I'm going to give you the floor. But until I see further questions, let me again go back to the two panelists. And my next question is, I'm curious, and both of you can jump in on this, that how these measures of the Trump administration are going to adversely impact even US businesses, because we are dealing with a globalized world. So let us say we have a US multinational company, and within the context of US locally, the Trump administration is saying, oh, you don't need to do DEI. But that company has operations globally. So how can they ignore DEI or climate change or other issues if they have global operations? So that creates a huge challenge for the same corporate group. So if you have any reflections on that, either of you or both of you, briefly. And of course, a related question I want to pose is that, do you see any prospect of businesses speaking up and saying to the Trump administration, formally or informally behind the scene, that, look, this is not a good idea. This is hurting us. Who wants to start first?
Joanne, you look like you're dying to jump in.
Well, I just wanted, yes, I mean,
Go for it, Joanne.
I'll say a couple of
Thank
things. You mentioned DEI and those rules and how they apply abroad, and I think it really it has had a chilling effect. And I just wanted to explain, for those who may not be aware, that Trump's executive order actually didn't create any new rules around DEI, but what it did is by ordering federal agencies to take an axe to DEI initiatives, they signaled that any companies that were pitching for government contracts might suffer if they have DEI. So that is why you are seeing even the most progressive companies have expunged DEI.
That is
from
360
their
degree
website.
turnout. No, normally one would expect incentives for businesses who are promoting DEI, because that's how we see responsible business conduct, right? So you will give incentives in public procurement, and now you're hinting, Joanne, that we're going in completely in the opposite direction, right?
So I probably a lot of people on this webinar, and if you don't, I highly recommend listening to Richard Howard's Strictly Speaking podcast. One of his latest ones was with Ann Kelly of Series, who runs a business leaders group, and I highly recommend it. And because she said something somewhat positive, and I'm not hearing a lot of positive things these days, but she did say that where we are today, in terms of whatever sustainability initiatives, ESG, is quite more advanced than where we were in 2017. So in 2007, during the first Trump administration. So in 2017, we didn't have science-based targets. We didn't have all this action at the states, which is something else we might want to talk about, because that's another bright spot in the United States. There wasn't the climate alliances, and importantly, we didn't have the Inflation Reduction Act, which was another incredible Biden achievement. And that Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, provided many levers, and there were lots of demonstrations of commitment. So and through the Inflation Reduction Act, Biden committed, and this was very smart, but something like 84% of the money in advance, and much of it goes to red states. And so there's a lot of, it's hard to see. It would have to take an act of Congress to kind of overturn the Inflation Reduction Act, because much of it comes in the form of tax credits, and it has this incredible bipartisan support. And there are some other bright spots. And so those were examples that she gave. And I think there are many others to say, companies don't just stop. They don't completely transform their HR practices on a dime. I mean, these are systems and programs that are embedded, and they certainly don't do it in the US, where there's this constant changing from as the political winds change. So I have heard progressive companies saying, we're not doing our hiring any different than the way we've always done our hiring, but we've had to take the language off the website. So we can debate what that implies, what that means, and what the actual effects are. I think that the more
So Joanne,
terrifying,
just to
if I
make
could
it
just
more fun, so are you suggesting creative compliance on the part of companies? So they will do still DEI in practice, but they may not use the title.
I think we're about due for a complete rehaul in the language that we use, because it's really about talent recruitment and retention, having a robust talent pool. Human rights activists don't like this term very much, but human capital, human resources. I mean, the whole financial market, the investors had determined that DEI was financially material. It's not just a nice to have, it's absolutely critical. I just wanted to add one thing. I think one of the most devastating, truly devastating effects is not so much that vis-a-vis DEI, but the 2023 Supreme Court ruling that removed from universities the ability to use affirmative action in making decisions about who comes to universities, because American universities are have the potential to be, and I think in many cases are, the great equalizer, where smart, motivated people from low-income households can come and get trained and have an opportunity, even if they didn't inherit wealth. And so you take that away. And I don't think the burden should be on businesses to fill that gap. There's certain amount of attention needs to be paid to how within the, because, and this is something I'd like to talk about later, but you know, how businesses survive when we're facing the kind of deep systemic risks that we're facing in our societies. And so they need to make extra measures. But I do think that we also have to look at the training, you know, the devastating effects at the university level that then feed into what is happening in terms of talent pool in the United States.
All right, so that's very interesting. So Marty, I would like to bring you in, and of course, once again, invite participants to pose questions in the Q&A. I already see a question in the chat, so I'm going to pick that after Marty makes her intervention. Yes, Marty, you have the floor now.
Sure, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think just to go back to the original framing of the question around, you know, is this good for business? Is this feasible for business to implement? I think the answer is no, this is not good for business. I think Joanne laid out really well, you know, the motivations for business to work on issues like DEI and other BHR issues. And I think if there is a silver lining to any of this, and I'm not sure yet that there is, but if there is a silver lining to all of this, I think it's that we're really stress testing the arguments that have been made over the years for why business does human rights, why business cares about human rights, right? And in the US, at least, to be frank, it's never really been about government pressure, right? We haven't had a very robust legal system or regulatory system in the US forcing companies to do a lot of this. It's mostly come from investor pressure, employee pressure, to some extent, customer and consumer pressure. And as Joanne said, this idea that this is financially good for their bottom line, right? And so we're going to stress test those assumptions as the US government not just takes the foot off the gas to the extent it was on the gas, but like tries to pump the brakes on some of these initiatives. And business is going to have to navigate how far it's willing to go to protect its bottom line versus not stick its neck out and put its head in the lion's mouth of, you know, getting on the wrong side of this administration and its allies. And that is a very real concern. And I think the one thing that is, I think Joanne's right that we are in a very different position in the BHR world from 8 years ago. We have a lot more systems in place. But I think we're going to see a very different reaction from business this time than we did 8 years ago, right? I think a lot of us in the US were really heartened to see in 2017 some of the statements from the private sector around some of Trump's immigration policies, the Muslim ban, and all of these, all of the pushback against, you know, there's very good people on all sides of these Nazi rallies and all this nonsense. You know, companies really publicly pushed back on those things. And I think we're not seeing that this time, and we're probably not going to see it for some time. And I think that's in part because, look, they spoke out last time and it didn't really have an impact on Trump coming back, right? Here we are again. But also, I think they've faced a much more direct threat. And so you're seeing either companies stay quiet and try and stay out of the spotlight, or you've seen a small subset of companies, but some very influential and important ones, particularly in the tech space, do a complete 180 and just make the decision that it is actually in their interest to align with the policies of the Trump administration. And so not do the bare minimum and not just strip the DEI language out and try and skate by, but actually, you know, fully embrace this movement the way Mark Zuckerberg has at Meta and say, yeah, we're not going to do the fact checking. We completely agree with you on these issues, and we're going to go as far as we possibly can. So we're in a very, very different moment. I think the last thing is just the larger business community is feeling the impacts of these administration policies already. The tariffs being the most obvious, you know, sort of existential threat in some ways to the U.S. private sector. They're in a triage moment of, you know, if you're bleeding, you've got to stop the bleeding before you can worry about, you know, your broken leg or whatever it is. And so they're trying to navigate one day we'll have a 25% steel tariff, the next day we don't situation that is a very existential, immediate threat to, can I make the car that I'm supposed to sell down the line? And so it's a little bit hard for them to concentrate on some of these things that might be relevant to their bottom line, but more of a nice to do, or, you know, a more remote threat to them than they're facing right now in these tariffs. But absolutely, these policies are hurting companies' bottom lines, not just the tariffs, but I'll just say a word about USAID, because this was referenced earlier, and I think it's worth just emphasizing. People forget the impact that these agencies have, the benefits that they generate for US companies. And it's not just the $2 billion in agricultural products that we export as part of our food assistance, right? People always talk about US food assistance without thinking about the fact that it comes from US farmers, and US farmers and companies are the ones selling those products that now have lost that business. But all of the work that the US government has done around the world to you know, to build electricity grids and more hospitable investment environments and workforce development and combating corruption so that US companies can operate in these environments, all of that pullback will be bad for companies' bottom line. At the same time, they're still trying to operate in those environments without the cover of the US government saying, don't bribe that official, you know, build that grid, do the community consultation, do the environmental impact assessment, all of the things that companies, for the most part, now have as part of their business plan, but they appreciate and have leveraged the top cover of the US government to say they have to do some of those things, or they should. They're losing that at the time that they really need it.
Thank you, Marty. And I think your point that USAID is not merely about aid, it is also about business opportunities for the US companies and farmers. And I think probably many policymakers are not making that connection. But let me ask you a supplementary question, and it's good that we are getting some questions now in Q&A, and I'm going to pose those questions and will request both of you to be brief so that we can take many of those questions if possible. But before I go to those questions, a supplementary question I have for you, Marty, is this, that instead of US businesses going public, as you mentioned, 2017, they went public. Do you see a possibility of more diplomacy behind the scene engagement by US businesses, engaging the administration that, look, this is not going to help anyone? Do you see any possibility of the more diplomatic role that businesses will play to push back against this?
I think businesses are speaking out behind the scenes. I think two things are happening behind the scenes, and this isn't just about around BHR, but around these kind of broader policy issues. One is they're trying to find other officials they can leverage. They're going to their governor, their state governor, or their mayor of the city that they're investing in, the places where their plants are and their businesses are that are feeling the impact. And they're trying to leverage those actors' influence in Washington or influence over Congress or Trump to try and do that. So they're, rather than trying to all get a hold of Trump and change his mind, they're trying to work their other angles. The other thing we're starting to see more and more of is industry associations, trade associations speaking out on behalf of their members. It helps kind of diffuse the risk a little bit if the entire industry or sector can speak with one voice. And so we're starting to see a little bit more even public statements from those associations who can provide a bit of insulation for companies that don't want to take the heat specifically. So I have to call out, you know, American Apparel and Footwear Association was were the only folks that spoke out so far publicly about USAID being shut down and the impact that that was going to have on their apparel and footwear companies. But more broadly on tariffs for Canada and Mexico and the EU and others, we're seeing those trade associations really be the tip of the spear in terms of engagement.
Thank you, Marty. Let me now take some of the questions. And one question is from Alien. She's asking that if the Trump administration is going after these human rights language in the same way as DEI, because specifically DEI is being picked. But what about, let us say, forced labor and other things? So do you think that impact is going to be all pervasive? And either of you can answer that question. And I think there's also a question from an anonymous participant is about ESG. So how do you see this in terms of backlash potentially against the role of investors? And ESG will also capture those issues, right? As part of S, for instance, it will be there. As part of governance, diversity and inclusion issues are relevant. So how do you see that play out? And maybe both of you can jump in, but try to be brief. Thank you.
I can
Maybe Joanne, do you want to start?
I'm happy to speak to investors. You may be aware that the largest institutional investors, BlackRock and State Street, along with Vanguard, now face a multi-state lawsuit alleging that they use ESG strategies to suppress things like coal production and manipulating energy markets and harming consumers and so forth. Those same major asset managers dropped board diversity requirements. They no longer require company boards to feature a certain percentage of women, those on their boards. But it's really being, obviously that's happening at the state level around DEI, but we're really seeing and really expect to see, based on what we saw in the first Trump administration, a real narrowing of shareholder power. So many look to investors to be a check on companies, because when companies engage in risky behavior, it's not good for profits and returns. So that investor leverage has always been important. It's been exercised through shareholder resolutions and other means. And what we're seeing is a sort of a suppression of that sort of shareholder power. So under the new acting SEC Security and Exchange Commissioner, it's now easier for company boards to block shareholder resolutions by putting these stricter filing requirements on funds and limiting investors' communications capabilities and so forth. They did the same sort of thing during the Trump one, and we are seeing much more of it. I think one of the most chilling effects recently has been new guidance on what's called Schedule 13G on beneficial ownership, who ultimately owns the company. And the new guidance really addresses how shareholders can engage with management. And it explicitly addresses what it calls pressure tactics. And you as an investor or shareholder can lose Schedule 13G eligibility if you exert pressure on management to implement specific measures. If you condition your support for director nominees on the adoption of particular policies, because that's been one of the most effective things that companies can do. And BlackRock has done this in human rights cases. Is in the case of what was it called? What was the glove manufacturer in Malaysia?
Oh, Top Glove.
Top Glove. It voted against, I
Mhm.
think, most of the directors at Top Glove when there was evidence of forced labor during the pandemic. So that capability is so important and would be withdrawn. And if those investors link their voting decisions to management's acceptance of their recommendations, then they could again lose this 13G eligibility. So all of these changes are very much in line with the Trump administration's efforts to dismantle diversity programs, withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. I don't know if we mentioned that yet. That is disheartening and difficult.
So is that a worrying sign? Remember, Joanne, you and many participants will be aware of this web of accountabilities, this ecosystem, the pressures coming from different. So in a way, what is happening is that this web of accountability, the multiple pressure points, are going to get undermined, right? I see a sense of that. So it's not just one set of actions, but multiple things are happening at the same time. And if we connect the dots, then it creates pressure on businesses to potentially ignore some of the issues. So the progress we have made post UN guiding principles, there's a real risk of regression on that. And I don't know if Marti wants to add something on that front.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, I think, look, we have a language problem, as Joanne referenced earlier, right? DEI, ESG, these things now are not just taboo, but, need to, are being stricken from every, both on the private sector side and in government are now unacceptable. But it's not just the language, right? I mean, when the Doge folks, the Elon Musk folks go into these departments and agencies and fired everybody that works on DEI, they also asked people sort of in a creepy reverse whistleblower way to say, tell us which titles got changed right before inauguration that used to be DEI and are now called human capital or human resources, or, you know, whatever other vanilla language you want to put in there, but are really doing DEI work, and we're going to fire them too, right? So they've figured out that, you know, the people are trying to kind of put new language on it, and they're doing the same thing. So there is, I think, an existential threat there. I think it goes back to the this kind of bottom line that I started with, which is that, you know, companies are going to look to what is in their financial interests, and all of the guardrails and all of the floors that government puts in can be changed in either direction, right? Everything that Trump is undoing can be redone in 4 years in the right circumstance, but it doesn't fundamentally change the economics. And so you've got to find a way to make these strategies really beneficial for companies' bottom lines, for them to want to have an incentive to invest in them over time. And I think the only other thing is just to go back to the question about, you know, what about forced labor? What about some of these core human rights issues? I think if we have learned nothing in the last 50 days, it is that, you know, whatever you think the lowest of the low is, there is something lower than that. There is something worse out there. So I put nothing past these guys. I think, you know, the argument that they made 4 years ago in the first Trump administration around enforcement of this forced labor ban was because of the competitiveness of U.S. industry, right? If they don't have to pay workers and we do, it's really unfair to U.S. companies. How are they going to compete? You know, that same logic applies to the FCPA, and they've turned it on its head, right? Well, they're not allowed to, if we're not allowed to bribe people and you are, it's not fair. So rather than saying you can't bribe people, we'll just say we can, right? It's the opposite of any kind of logic you would imagine. I wouldn't
Or
be
any
surprised.
leadership, right? There's no leadership.
Well, of course.
None.
So I wouldn't be surprised if you start to see that same logic around any regulatory or legal step that makes it more expensive for companies to operate when others don't have to meet that same standard, rather than say everyone should, you know, rise to our level. It's increasingly, you know, we can just sink to that level as well.
Can I just add just very, very quickly here? I think the questioner asked something about human, is the DEI prohibition brought into human rights? And I'd actually be interested in Marty's answer here, but I would just point out that the first Trump administration did withdraw the U.S. from the UN Human Rights Council. But when it you know, the new U.S. Canadian Mexico agreement, the replacement of NAFTA, actually did have measures that really strengthened protections for worker rights and helped to institute a border ban on forced labor, both in Canada and Mexico, as well as the US. So you saw some advances there. Maybe that's a positive thing. I don't know, Marty, what you think, if you think that where they stand on human rights.
We're sort of in a post human rights phase here in the US. I don't think that logic is going to carry through. I don't put any stock in the Human Rights Commission, because every Republican administration in the US has pulled out of the Human Rights Commission, and every Democratic one has gone back in, going many administrations before Trump. That's just the state of US politics. It doesn't mean very much substantively. I think you're absolutely right. There was a lot of good language in the USMCA around human rights issues, surprisingly, in the same way it was very surprising in the way that they enforced the Tariff Act ban. But you know, they've pulled back on the USMCA itself, right? The very agreement that Trump negotiated, the trade agreement that he championed, that he said was the best agreement ever reached because he reached it, he is now thrown out and said, you know, it doesn't work. So I don't think they feel beholden to any positions that they took 4 years ago. And I think we're in a place where there's such a knee-jerk allergic reaction to government interfering in any way in either business or society that there's very, very little appetite to say even this very, very basic standards around, you know, paying workers or, you know, basic treatment of human rights issues is worthy of government engagement. I think that's where they're landing so far, with the small caveat that I think there are people in the administration that have differing views on this, and there are people driven by different motivations, including still a very strong stream of anti-China folks in this administration who are still looking for any lever or stick they can kind of deploy against China, and forced labor is and human rights more broadly is certainly one of them. So over time, you may start to see some of that come out as the administration gets distracted by other things. But I think as an overall policy, this is a very, very different administration than we saw the first time around, which was very isolationist, very sort of, we just need to stay out of this. Now it is, we have a worldview, and it is, you know, our worldview, and it is a very specific one that we want to impose on everybody else. So we're just, I think, in a different place, unfortunately.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned China, and I think that connects nicely with one of the questions that has been posed, and it is about that whether this US regulation about forced labor ban of the products coming into the US market, is this a mask to prohibit the foreign goods coming to the US? For instance, could this administration extend the regulation to beyond Xinjiang and China and extend to forced labor coming out of anywhere? And that may kind of fit nicely with the narrative that make in the US, manufacture in the US, make US great, you know. And if the foreign goods are coming, that is not making the US great. So do you have any quick view on that? Because I also want to touch upon, before we wrap it up, about the impact of US administration outside the US, and maybe connect the dots a little bit with what is happening within European Union. So if you can be extremely brief, that will be good on this question. Forced labor, do you think this is there's a risk here that the administration may go wider than Xinjiang and China?
Yeah, I'll say something very quick, and then I'll let Joanne talk about the EU. I think, so one, we do already have a global ban on goods made with forced labor coming into the US. That's been in place prior to this Xinjiang ban. And it has been fairly robustly enforced, although I will say resources were shifted in the last 4 years to focus on the Uyghur products in particular. That's mainly pressure from Congress more than coming from the Biden administration. And I think that pressure is still there. And so that broader global enforcement is going to be a function of, do they have the manpower and resources to actually enforce it? But I think it's a very astute question, which is, you know, what other tools or levers could the administration deploy to incentivize companies to source from the US? And this is certainly one of them. So I think that my suspicion is that ban will continue to be enforced. I also think there's been an interest in Congress for some time in expanding the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which is really focused on products physically coming out of China to products made by Chinese companies anywhere in the world, right? And arguing, although you could certainly question the facts behind this, but arguing that Chinese companies use forced labor everywhere they go, and therefore we should assume that any goods produced by a Chinese company are made with forced labor. That could happen in Congress. That would significantly change the enforcement of that global ban.
Mm-hmm. So should we touch upon briefly on what you see as the ripple effect of the Trump administration policies outside the US borders? And I'm wondering here if there is any correlation between what is happening within the US and what is happening in the European Union in terms of the omnibus proposal in particular. Because there is something that has been celebrated as a victory, CS-DDD in particular. Now there are hints, serious hints, that could be significantly diluted, also because of the significant business lobbying. So then how does we make this connection between what is happening in the US and what may be happening in the European Union? Any reflections on that?
I imagine that my European colleagues have some insights from the on-the-ground conversations that they're having, but I think one thing we know is a fact is that even though you had some behind-the-scenes lobbying reported from major US companies and investors, including BlackRock, to try to, you know, push for that investor exception and the original CS-DDD and so forth, the Biden administration was actively in conversations supporting, I mean, it certainly, and I think really wanting to see alignment of what was happening in Europe with its own rules. And so I think overall you can interpret and see the actions of the Biden administration as quite supportive of the CS-DDD, even if some of the companies weren't so much. So what you're losing, of course, is that pressure, is that communication, is that support from the US. And I'm sure that there is a sense of, on the part of businesses, of, you know, let's level the playing field. Why do those businesses in Europe need to adhere to a higher standard when other companies, including the United States, don't have to? But of course, we all know that there are many US companies that are in scope of the CS-DDD. I assume may continue to be in scope, certainly are in scope of the German supply chain law, which I also know is under threat. But that's another reason why we can expect at least the larger companies to continue to be putting in place their, I mean, the CS-DDD will exist, and the CS and the other regulations and the CSRD and others will exist. There are still going to be, it's still important for companies to take measures to strengthen their human rights due diligence and strengthen their ability to demonstrate it through reporting and adherence to the other regulations. So I have always wondered why, if with the omnibus, if, you know, with the restricting of the number of companies in scope to just the very largest companies, if you're not actually going, first of all, you're going to have a ripple effect no matter what because of those supply chains. Secondly, I would imagine that those largest companies are going to want to see that push for that expansion again. So they're not the only ones subject to these laws. But I'm, again, I would love to hear from my European colleagues if there's any on this call, and also perhaps Marty has more to add here.
Yeah, maybe Marty, you can jump in, and maybe if you can also react to my supplementary point that do you foresee a race to the bottom now? Because earlier we were pushing the US, oh, do better, follow mandatory route. Canada is going slowly towards post-labor mandatory and all that, you know. And now if European Union is going and in a backward, in a way, regressive and diluting things, then instead of pushing for race to the top, we're moving towards race to the bottom, is it?
I think in some ways, yes. I mean, maybe the grass is always greener and things are so bad here in the US that, you know, things must be better elsewhere. But to me, what it feels like, and I absolutely am not in the weeds on the EU law, the way the folks kind of battling it out on the ground are. And so I'm sure they have their own perspective. But from where I sit, I think there is a difference between you know, slowing down the progress that's happening in Europe, or even watering down this potential groundbreaking legislation, and what's happening in the US, which is not just stopping US government efforts, but active efforts by the government to stop companies from good performance, right? To actually say, we think you should bribe more people, you know, we think you should maybe not worry so much about forced labor. So to me, there's still a difference. I think Europe, to me, still feels like, okay, we've hit a huge obstacle. We've slowed it way down. We're not making nearly the progress we thought we were, but we're not actively moving backwards. Now we'll see if the German law, you know, gets repealed, if we start to see some of this stuff get pulled back entirely, that's worrisome. If we start to see European governments tell companies, we don't want your DEI stuff over here too, that's really upsetting. I think that we haven't seen that yet in Europe the way we have in the US. What I am worried about, though, is the influence that this administration may have on Europe. I think, you know, in the world of tech regulation, there is obviously concern about the EU Digital Services Act and the impact, you know, the idea that, you know, so many of those companies that the Europeans are regulating under the DSA are US companies. the pressure that the Trump administration is going to put on Europe to back away from enforcement of that, how much does that start to extend to other corporate accountability initiatives, and what are they willing to kind of leverage or threaten to get the EU to back off? So I think there is a very real risk of the spread being very direct and very sort of intentional, rather than just the sort of slow deterioration of progress. But I do think we're in a very, very dangerous moment and the threat is ironically coming from what have historically been some of the most supportive governments on BHR issues.
Okay, thank you. We're almost coming to an end, so I would like to give each one of you, let us say 90 seconds maximum each. And if you could also respond in that, your concluding observations, do you feel optimistic? Where are we going? Because we have seen COVID, conflicts, climate change, AI, and now Trump. So the challenges keep coming, right? So where do you see it? Do you see optimistic? And also there's a question that I want to bring in and weave into this, your closing remarks, that is about what can the stakeholders do if US companies are accused of violating human rights? What are the options for them if the US administration is not going to take a progressive stand on those particular issues? So maybe I will start with Joanne and give the final words to Marty. But brief, please. So 90 seconds each maximum. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm not optimistic. I wish I could be. I'm trying to look for the bright spots. I raised a few of them here. As you know, I'm actually sitting in Sydney right now. And when we started organizing this webinar, I immediately remembered that I had been teaching at Melbourne Uni Law School and gave a lecture there in June 2017. I think I was titled something like BHR in the Age of Anti-Globalism. And in preparing the conversation today, I went back and read that lecture note and see that the dynamics were all there. In fact, I could have probably pulled up those lecture notes and sort of in some respects and sort of just in terms of laying out exactly what is the groundwork that's being laid for where we are today. We could see it coming, and no matter how hard we in the BHR community saw it coming or how clearly we saw it, we couldn't seem to stop it. And that said, in the intervening years, we made all this progress in terms of embedding BHR norms into laws. So how can we do better? One of the issues that my organization, Rights CoLab, has been pushing actually since the height of the pandemic is more attention to the systemic risk of inequality, which breeds polarization and sort of support for authoritarianism. And here's where I think the BHR community can do more. What happens when you can't tie a specific harm directly to a company that continues every day to, in its operations and through its business models to externalize its social costs in ways that have this like large cumulative effect on the health and well-being of economies? So you think of failure to ensure a living wage paid throughout your supply chain is the most commonly cited example, but there are plenty of others, including tax practices and investment structures that prioritize short-term profiteering and access to healthcare and benefits and use of gig workers and so on and so forth. I don't think BHR practitioners have thought deeply enough about how to apply the BHR frameworks to tackle inequality and what adaptations we need to that sort of developing that risk management system to address the systemic risk of inequality. Of course, we always know that rules are going to be the thing that gets there. And that's where
Joanne,
optimism stops. So that's it.
Marty, your 1 minute. I'm sorry, but yeah.
Okay, I'll be super quick. Am I optimistic? No. I think if you're optimistic right now, you are not paying attention to what's going on. Look, I left government the first time in 2017 and went to work on BHR because I didn't think that the US government was going to do its job working on issues I cared about. And I thought that influencing the business community was the next best thing. And so I think my advice is find your allies, right? Find the folks in the business world that are still trying to do their work as best they can and find ways of helping them. Be creative and thoughtful about your engagement and communication strategies. Think carefully about when to name and shame versus when to engage, including when to compliment publicly, because that may not be the moment for that either. So just think very carefully about your communications. And for the bad actors out there, bide your time, right? That no era lasts forever. Statutes have long, the statute of limitations in the FCPA is 5 years. Our election cycle is shorter than that. Take your time, collect your evidence, do what you need to do to preserve those opportunities and wait for the right moment for accountability, because I think if we do our job well, it will come back around.
Thank you for giving some practical tips. And as we have seen what just happened to the former president of the Philippines, so definitely that connects with that issue that the arms of the law sometimes are long and they get used. So I think businesses should think carefully that this is not merely these 3-4 years, right? They have to be in the business more than 4 years, and I think prepare for that. And of course, consider the whole ecosystem, what make businesses successful. So thank you both of you, Joanne and Marty, for joining this interesting conversation. Time is never enough to discuss those issues. And thank you all the participants for asking those questions, very much appreciated. And watch out for more what we do as B&HR Access to Justice Lab at Macquarie University. But bye for now. Thank you, everyone.